The musket ball whistled past Lieutenant Colonel George Washington's ear, splintering the bark of an ancient oak tree behind him. At 22 years old, the young Virginian had just fired the shot that would echo across 2 continents and forever alter the destiny of North America. It was May 28th, 1754, and Washington's small force of colonial militia had just ambushed a French reconnaissance party in the dense forests of the Ohio Valley, killing the French commander Joseph Callan de Jumonville and 9 of his men. What Washington didn't realize in that moment was that this skirmish near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania, would be remembered as the opening shot of what Europeans would call the 7 Years' War. But what colonists knew as the French and Indian War, the echo of those muskets would reverberate for decades, ultimately leading 13 colonies to declare independence from the very empire they were now fighting to expand. The conflict had been brewing for years, like a storm gathering on the horizon. France and Britain, the 2 great powers of the 18th century, had been circling each other like wolves, each seeking to dominate the lucrative fur trade and vast territorial expanses of North America. The French had established a string of forts from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, effectively encircling the British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: control the rivers and lakes, forge alliances with Native American tribes, and strangle British expansion westward. The British colonies, however, were bursting at the seams. By 1750, over 1 million colonists called the eastern seaboard home, and they cast hungry eyes toward the fertile valleys beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie had dispatched the young Washington to demand French withdrawal from the Ohio Valley, but the French commander Ligardeur de Saint-Pierre had politely but firmly refused. The stage was set for confrontation. According to historical accounts from the Pennsylvania Gazette, Washington's attack on Jumonville's party was controversial even at the time. The French claimed Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission, carrying a summons for the British to withdraw from French territory. Washington and his Seneca ally, the half-king Tanacharison, saw it differently. They viewed the French as spies, scouting British positions. In the heat of the moment, Tanacharison reportedly struck the wounded Jumonville with his tomahawk, killing him instantly. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Washington hastily constructed a crude fortification he optimistically named Fort Necessity. But within weeks, a larger French force, under Jumonville's brother, Captain Louis Callan de Villiers, surrounded the position. On July 4th, 1754, 22 years to the day before another, more famous, July 4th, Washington was forced to surrender. The document he signed, written in French, inadvertently admitted to the assassination of Jumonville, a diplomatic blunder that would haunt him for years. News of these frontier skirmishes traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but when it reached London and Versailles, it sparked a global conflagration. King George II and his ministers saw an opportunity to break French power in North America once and for all. King Louis XV viewed British aggression as a threat to France's entire colonial empire. Both empires began mobilizing for what would become the first truly global war. Fought across 4 continents and countless seas, the war that began with a young colonial's musket, shot in the Pennsylvania wilderness, soon engulfed the globe like a wildfire jumping from tree to tree. By 1756, the conflict had spread from the forests of North America to the plains of Europe, from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the trading posts of India. Never before had humanity witnessed warfare on such a scale, with battles raging simultaneously across 4 continents in North America. The early years brought disaster after disaster for the British and their colonial allies. The French, led by capable commanders like the Marquis de Montcalm, seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to strike where least expected. Their Native American allies, primarily from the Algonquian tribes, moved through the wilderness like ghosts, appearing suddenly to devastate British settlements before melting back into the forest. The summer of 1755 brought perhaps the most shocking defeat in British military history. General Edward Braddock, a veteran of European warfare, led a massive expedition of British regulars and Colonial militia toward the French stronghold of Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River. His force included nearly 1,500 men, along with artillery and supplies, making it the largest military expedition ever assembled in North America to that point. Braddock's army moved through the wilderness with the ponderous precision of European warfare, cutting a road 12 feet wide through the dense forest. The general dismissed warnings from colonial officers like George Washington, who had been promoted to aide-de-camp, about the unconventional tactics of frontier warfare. These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia. Braddock reportedly scoffed, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops. "Sir, it is impossible they should make any impression." On July 9th, 1755, Braddock's confidence was shattered, along with his army. As the British force approached the Monongahela River, just 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, they walked into a carefully planned ambush. French Marines, Canadian militia, Native American warriors hidden behind trees and rocks unleashed devastating volleys into the tightly packed British ranks. The red-coated soldiers, trained to fight in open European battlefields, found themselves helpless. Against an enemy they could barely see, the slaughter was horrific. Braddock himself was mortally wounded, shot through the chest as he tried to rally his men. George Washington, despite having 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes through his coat, miraculously survived the carnage of the 1,300 British and colonial troops who entered the battle. Fewer than 500 escaped death or capture. The retreat became a rout, with panicked soldiers abandoning cannons, supplies, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight. As documented in contemporary accounts from the Maryland Gazette, the disaster at the Monongahela sent shockwaves throughout colonial America. The myth of British military invincibility lay shattered in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Colonial settlements from Virginia to Pennsylvania lived in terror of French and Native American raids, while the surviving British forces huddled in fortifications, afraid to venture into the countryside. The defeat had profound psychological effects on the colonial psyche. For the first time, many colonists began to question whether their mother country was capable of protecting them. Young men who had served alongside Washington in the retreat, like Daniel Morgan and Daniel Boone, learned hard lessons about wilderness warfare that would serve them well in a future conflict. The disaster also revealed the deep cultural divide between British regulars and colonial militia, with each side blaming the other for the catastrophe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the war was reshaping the balance of power in Europe. Frederick, the Great of Prussia, subsidized by British gold, was fighting for his kingdom's survival against a coalition of Austria, France, and Russia. The conflict had become a chess game played by kings and ministers. With pawns scattered across the globe, the year 1757 brought new hope to the British cause with the appointment of William Pitt the Elder as Secretary of State. Pitt, a man of towering ambition and strategic vision, understood that this war would determine the fate of empires. He declared his intention to conquer America and Germany by subsidizing Frederick the Great's armies while simultaneously launching massive expeditions across the Atlantic. Pitt's strategy was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its execution. He poured unprecedented resources into the North American theater, sending over 20,000 British regulars across the Atlantic and authorizing the recruitment of colonial troops on a scale never before attempted. Most importantly, he began promoting capable officers based on merit rather than social connections, elevating men like Jeffrey Amherst and James Wolfe to positions of command. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The 1757 campaign season brought mixed results, with British forces capturing the French fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, but failing to take Fort Carillon, later renamed Fort Ticonderoga, in upstate New York. The attack on Fort Carillon, led by General James Abercrombie, resulted in another devastating defeat for British arms. The Marquis de Montcalm, commanding fewer than 4,000 French and Canadian troops, repelled a direct assault by over 15,000 British and colonial soldiers. The battle at Fort Carillon on July 8, 1758, showcased both the courage and the tactical limitations of British forces. Wave after wave of kilted Highland regiments and Colonial Rangers charged up the slope toward the French fortifications, only to be cut down by withering musket fire. The attacking forces suffered nearly 2,000 casualties in a single afternoon, while French losses numbered fewer than 400. Despite this setback, the tide of war was gradually shifting. British naval supremacy was beginning to strangle French supply lines to North America. Ships loaded with reinforcements, weapons, and supplies found themselves blockaded in French ports or captured on the high seas. The French colonies, always dependent on the mother country for manufactured goods and military support, began to feel the squeeze of isolation. The 1759 campaign season would prove to be the annus mirabilis, the year of miracles for British arms. 3 major expeditions were launched simultaneously, one against Fort Niagara in the west, another against Fort Carillon and Fort St. Frederick in the north, and a third against the ultimate prize, Quebec City itself. The expedition against Fort Niagara, led by General John Prideaux and Sir William Johnson, succeeded in capturing this crucial link in the French chain of fortifications. The fort controlled the portage between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, making it essential for French communications with their western posts. Its capture effectively severed New France's connections to the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. Meanwhile, General Amherst's forces finally captured Fort Carillon, though they found it abandoned and partially destroyed by its retreating garrison. The French, recognizing that their position was becoming untenable, were beginning a strategic withdrawal toward the St. Lawrence River Valley. But the most dramatic and consequential campaign was unfolding along the St. Lawrence River.
Where?
32-year-old General James Wolfe was leading a combined Army and Navy expedition against Quebec City. The city, perched on towering cliffs overlooking the river, was considered impregnable. Its capture would require not just military skill, but also courage bordering on recklessness. According to military historians' accounts in the London Chronicle, Wolfe's expedition represented the largest amphibious operation in British history to that point. Over 40 ships carried nearly 9,000 soldiers up the treacherous St. Lawrence River, navigating currents and shallows that had claimed countless vessels over the centuries. The French, led by Montcalm, prepared to defend their capital. With the desperation of men fighting for their homeland survival, the siege of Quebec City began in late June 1759, as General James Wolfe's army established positions on the Isle of Orleans and the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. For 2 months, the British bombarded the city with artillery, reducing much of its lower town to rubble, but the fortress remained impregnable. The French defenders, commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm, held strong positions along the Beauport shore and seemed content to wait out the approaching Canadian winter. Wolfe, a brilliant but temperamental officer, known for his red hair and fierce ambition, grew increasingly frustrated as the weeks passed. His health was failing. He suffered from rheumatism, kidney stones, and what contemporaries called nervous disorders, and he knew that his army would have to withdraw before the St. Lawrence froze. In desperate letters to his superiors, he complained that the French position was so strong that I can't flatter myself that I shall be able to reduce it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Captain Robert Stobo, a Virginian who had been held prisoner by the French since Braddock's defeat, managed to pass intelligence to the British about a poorly guarded path up the cliffs west of Quebec City. The path known as the Anseau Fowlin, or Wolfe's Cove, was considered so steep and treacherous that the French had stationed only a small guard at its top. On the night of September 12, 1759, Wolfe launched one of the most audacious operations in military history. Under cover of darkness, 4,800 British troops silently loaded into boats and floated down the St. Lawrence River with the tide. The plan required perfect timing. The boats had to arrive at the cove just as the tide began to turn, allowing the troops to land and scale the cliffs before dawn, revealed their presence to French sentries. The operation nearly failed before it began. As the boats approached the landing site, a French sentry called out "Qui vive?" Who goes there? Quick-thinking Captain Donald MacDonald, a Highland officer who spoke French, replied that they were provision boats from Montreal. The sentry, expecting such a supply run, allowed them to pass. Minutes later, the first British soldiers were scrambling up the narrow path in single file, their muskets slung across their backs. By dawn on September 13th, Wolfe had achieved the impossible. Nearly 5,000 British troops stood in battle formation on the Plains of Abraham, the plateau west of Quebec City. The French, awakened by the sound of British drums and fifes, could scarcely believe their eyes. Montcalm, riding out from the city to assess the situation, reportedly exclaimed, "This is serious." Before galloping back to organize a counterattack, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted less than 30 minutes, but decided the fate of North America. Montcalm, realizing that delay would only allow more British troops to scale the cliffs, ordered an immediate attack with whatever forces he could quickly assemble. The French charge was brave but poorly coordinated, with regular troops, militia, and Native American allies advancing in ragged formation across the open ground. The British, formed in their traditional red line to ranks deep, waited with disciplined patience as the French approached. Wolfe, despite his illness, moved among his men, offering encouragement. When the French were within 40 yards, he gave the command to fire. The synchronized volley from nearly 3,000 muskets tore through the French ranks like a scythe. Through wheat, both commanding generals fell mortally wounded in the brief but savage fighting that followed. Montcalm, struck by a musket ball in his stomach, was helped back into Quebec City, where he died the following morning. Wolfe, hit by 3 musket balls, died on the battlefield as his men pursued the retreating French. His last words, according to witnesses, were now, "God be praised. I die in peace," upon hearing that the French were fleeing, as recorded in dispatches to the London Gazette. The victory at Quebec City sent shockwaves throughout Europe and America. For the first time in the war, a major French stronghold had fallen to British arms. The psychological impact was enormous. If Quebec could be taken, and French power in North America might be broken entirely. The capture of Quebec City didn't end the war, but it marked the beginning of the end for New France. The following year, British forces under General Amherst closed in on Montreal, the last major French stronghold in North America. Surrounded and outnumbered, the French Governor-General Vaudreuil surrendered on September 8th. Effectively ending French rule in Canada, the fall of Montreal in September 1760 marked the effective end of French power in North America, but the global conflict continued to rage across oceans and continents. Spain, France's ally since 1762, entered the war in hopes of regaining territories lost in previous conflicts. British forces found themselves fighting not just in North America, but in the Caribbean, where valuable sugar islands changed hands multiple times, and in the Philippines, where Manila fell to British assault. The war's conclusion came with the Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, in the glittering halls of Versailles. The treaty's terms were staggering in their scope and would reshape the map of North America forever. France ceded all of Canada and its claims to territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain, to compensate for its losses, received Louisiana west of the Mississippi and the vital port of New Orleans from its French ally. For the British Empire, the victory seemed complete and overwhelming. The Union Jack now flew from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, and British colonists could look westward, toward lands that stretched to the Pacific Ocean. The Empire had gained over 1 million square miles of new territory, along with the French. Fishing rights off Newfoundland and several valuable Caribbean islands. However, the celebration in London was tempered by sobering realities. The war had been staggeringly expensive, costing the British Treasury over £80 million, a sum so vast that it doubled the national debt. The annual interest payments alone exceeded the entire peacetime budget of many European nations. King George III and his ministers faced the daunting challenge of administering vast new territories. While somehow paying for the war that had won them, the human cost had been equally staggering. Historians estimate that over 1 million people died during the 9 years of global conflict, with casualties ranging from European battlefields to American frontier settlements. From Caribbean sugar plantations to Indian trading posts, entire Native American tribes had been displaced or destroyed, their traditional ways of life shattered by the collision of European empires. In the American colonies, the war's end brought both relief and unexpected challenges. Colonial soldiers, who had fought alongside British regulars, returned home with new perspectives on their place in the empire. Men like George Washington, who had served with distinction throughout the conflict, had gained valuable military experience, but also witnessed firsthand the condescension and cultural prejudices of British officers toward colonial troops. War had also created the first truly American military heroes. Men like Robert Rogers and his Rangers, who had perfected the art of wilderness warfare, became legends in their own time. Colonial newspapers celebrated their exploits, and their tactics would influence American military thinking for generations to come. The successful defense of frontier settlements had proven that Americans could fight effectively when properly led and motivated. Perhaps most importantly, the war had forged connections between colonists from different regions who had previously had little contact with each other. Virginia planters fought alongside Massachusetts farmers, Pennsylvania merchants, and Carolina frontiersmen. These shared experiences created bonds of friendship and mutual respect that transcended colonial boundaries. As documented in Benjamin Franklin's correspondence from this period, many colonists emerged from the war with a new sense of their own capabilities and identity. They had proven themselves capable of matching European soldiers in battle, of organizing complex military campaigns, and of governing themselves effectively during times of crisis. The psychological impact of these realizations would prove far more significant than anyone imagined at the time. The war had also exposed fundamental tensions within the British Empire. Colonial assemblies had gained unprecedented power during the conflict as royal governors desperate for military supplies, and troops had been forced to negotiate with local representatives. The colonies had proven capable of raising and equipping armies, managing logistics, and conducting diplomatic relations with Native American tribes. All functions that had previously been the exclusive domain of imperial authorities. The ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Paris when King George III faced a crisis that would ultimately prove more dangerous than any French army. The vast territories acquired through victory needed to be governed, defended, and most urgently paid for. The solution proposed by the king's ministers would set in motion a chain of events that would tear the empire apart within a generation. The first shock came with the Proclamation of 1763, issued by the Crown in October of that year. The proclamation drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonial settlement west of this boundary without royal permission. The stated purpose was to prevent conflicts with Native American tribes, but to colonists who had fought and died to secure these lands. The proclamation felt like a betrayal. Colonial land speculators, including George Washington himself, saw fortunes evaporating overnight. Veterans who had been promised Western lands in exchange for their military service found their grants worthless. The proclamation seemed to suggest that the British government valued the friendship of Native American tribes more than the loyalty of its own subjects, who had shed blood for the empire. The real bombshell came in 1764 with the passage of the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act of 1765. These measures, designed by Chancellor George Grenville to raise revenue in the colonies, marked a fundamental shift in imperial policy. For the first time, Parliament was imposing taxes on the colonies, not to regulate trade, but purely to raise money for the imperial treasury. The colonial reaction was immediate and explosive. The phrase "taxation without representation" became the rallying cry of opposition movements from Massachusetts to Georgia. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denouncing the taxes as violations of their rights as Englishmen. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, while crowds took to the streets in protests that sometimes turned violent. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 revealed the depth of colonial resistance to imperial authority. The act required tax stamps on virtually all printed materials, from newspapers to playing cards, from legal documents to ship manifests. The tax collectors, many of them prominent colonists who had accepted the posts for their financial rewards, found themselves facing crowds of angry protesters who demanded their resignations in Boston. The situation became particularly volatile. Andrew Oliver, the designated stamp distributor, was hanged in effigy from the Liberty Tree, a massive elm that became a symbol of resistance. When Oliver refused to resign, a mob demolished his house and threatened his family. Similar scenes played out in other colonial cities, with stamp distributors resigning under pressure and their offices being destroyed. The crisis deepened when colonial merchants organized a comprehensive boycott of British goods. The boycott, coordinated through correspondence networks that stretched from New Hampshire to South Carolina, proved devastatingly effective. British exports to America fell by over 40%, throwing thousands of British workers out of employment and forcing manufacturers to petition Parliament for relief. According to contemporary accounts in the Pennsylvania Journal, boycott revealed the colony's economic power within the empire. Colonial consumers had become essential to British prosperity, purchasing everything from textiles to hardware, from books to luxury goods. The sudden loss of this market sent shockwaves through the British economy and forced Parliament to reconsider its policies. The Stamp Act, Congress, which met in New York in October 1765, marked another crucial step in the development of colonial resistance. Representatives from 9 colonies gathered to coordinate their opposition to the tax, drafting petitions to the king and Parliament that asserted colonial rights while maintaining loyalty to the crown. The Congress established precedents for intercolonial cooperation that would prove vital in future crises. Faced with economic pressure and colonial resistance, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766, but it simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This seemingly contradictory approach, giving ground on the immediate issue while asserting absolute authority and principle, satisfied no one and resolved nothing. The pattern would repeat itself throughout the late 1760s and early 1770s. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on paint, glass, tea, and other imported goods, leading to renewed boycotts and protests. The presence of British troops in Boston, originally sent to maintain order, became a source of constant tension that erupted in the Boston Massacre of 1770. Each crisis seemed to push the colonies further from the mother country that had once commanded their loyalty and affection. The generation that had fought alongside British regulars against French and Native American enemies now found themselves in conflict with those same British authorities. The war that had been fought to secure the blessings of British civilization for colonial America had somehow created the conditions for its rejection. By 1773, the British Empire seemed to be sleepwalking toward a catastrophe that few people on either side of the Atlantic actually wanted. The colonists still proclaimed their loyalty to King George III, while insisting they would not submit to parliamentary taxation. The British government, for its part, remained convinced that firmness would eventually bring the colonies to heel. Both sides were trapped by principles they could not abandon. Without losing face, the final crisis began with something as mundane as a corporate bailout. The East India Company, that great engine of British commercial expansion, is facing bankruptcy despite its monopoly on trade with India. The company's warehouses in London were overflowing with unsold tea. While its political influence in Parliament remained enormous, the solution proposed by Lord North's government was the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the company a virtual monopoly on tea sales in America. While maintaining the tax imposed by the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act was intended to be an elegant solution to multiple problems. The East India Company would be saved from bankruptcy. Government would maintain its right to tax the colonies, and American consumers would actually pay lower prices for their tea. What the ministry failed to anticipate was the colonial reaction to what they perceived as a conspiracy to destroy their economic independence. Colonial merchants, who had built profitable businesses importing and distributing tea, saw their livelihoods threatened by the East India Company's monopoly. More importantly, colonial leaders recognized that if Parliament could grant monopolies to favored companies, it could destroy any colonial business that competed with British interests. The tea acts seemed to confirm their worst fears about imperial intentions. The resistance began in the ports where the tea ships were expected to arrive. In New York and Philadelphia, popular pressure forced the ships to return to England without unloading their cargo. In Charleston, the tea was landed but stored in warehouses where it rotted unsold. Only in Boston, where the royal governor Thomas Hutchinson was determined to enforce the law, did the confrontation escalate to the point of no return. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, was both a carefully planned political demonstration and an act of calculated defiance. The participants, many of them members of the Sons of Liberty, spent hours in Old South meeting, house debating whether to force the tea ships to leave Boston Harbor. When Governor Hutchinson refused to grant the ships clearance to depart, Samuel Adams reportedly declared this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. What followed was political theater of the highest order. Approximately 50 men, their faces blackened with soot and coal dust and dressed as Mohawk Indians, marched to Griffin's Wharf where the 3 tea ships were moored. Working with military precision, they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. While thousands of spectators watched from the shore, the entire operation was conducted with remarkable discipline. The only damage was to a single padlock, which the participants carefully replaced. The British response was swift and catastrophic. The Coercive Acts of 1774, which colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts, were designed to punish Massachusetts and serve as a warning to other colonies. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act virtually eliminated colonial self-government. And the Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than in colonial courts. As documented in the Virginia Gazette, the Coercive Acts had exactly the opposite effect from what the British government intended. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, they rallied the other colonies too. Its support. The Virginia House of Burgesses called for a day of fasting and prayer. South Carolina sent rice to feed the people of Boston. The other colonies recognized that what was happening to Massachusetts could happen to them if they failed to act. The Continental Congress that convened in Philadelphia in September 1770 brought together the most talented political leaders from 12 colonies, men like George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee, gathered to coordinate resistance to British policies, while still hoping for reconciliation with the mother country. Their Declaration of Rights and Grievances outlined colonial complaints while affirming loyalty to the Crown. The Congress also established the Continental Association, a comprehensive boycott of British goods that would remain in effect until the Coercive Acts were repealed. Local committees were organized to enforce the boycott, creating a shadow government that gradually replaced royal authority in many areas. The success of these committees demonstrated that Americans could govern themselves without British supervision. By the spring of 1775, both sides were trapped by their own rhetoric and the logic of their positions. The British government could not retreat from the Coercive Acts without appearing to surrender to colonial pressure. The colonists could not abandon their resistance without accepting parliamentary supremacy. When British troops marched on Lexington and Concord in April 1775, they were trying to confiscate weapons that colonists believed they might need to defend their liberties. The shots fired at Lexington Green on April 19, 1775, were the inevitable result of policies set in motion by the French and Indian War. The conflict that had begun with George Washington's ambush in the Pennsylvania wilderness had created an empire too large and expensive for its own good. The attempt to govern and pay for that empire had destroyed the very loyalty that had made it possible. The revolution that followed was not the result of a sudden break with Britain, but rather the culmination of a process that had been building. For over a decade, the war that had made Britain the dominant power in North America had also created the conditions for its own defeat. The colonists who had fought to expand the British Empire would now fight to leave it, using the military skills and political unity they had developed during the French and Indian War. The young lieutenant colonel who had fired the first shot of the French and Indian War would become the commanding general of the Continental Army. Leading the colonies he had once fought to defend in their struggle for independence, the empire that had seemed so triumphant in 1763 would face its greatest crisis just 12 years later, torn apart by the very success that had made it great.